Brother, help me!
So the latest Pokemon games, Scarlet and Violet, have come out in, let's go with the few notes from QA got ignored.
This is terrible.
It's awful.
The state of the game, even with the launch day patch, has gotten a lot of attention for the various oddities in both games. Constant poppin', the starting, there's even now a confirmed memory leak that can cause severe issues if you keep the game running for more than 24 hours. And yet, while I'm surprised by just how unfinished the game feels, I'm not shocked that a new Pokemon game has all these technical troubles, and no, it's not because it's on the Switch like I've seen some people suggest. We'll get to that. It's because it's made by Game Freak. Whenever a title made by a big studio like, I don't know, let's say Bethesda, comes out with notable performance issues, as basically every Bethesda game of the past 5 years has done, people are so quick to raise their pitchforks and torches, and rightfully so. Most Bethesda games, as I mentioned, are notoriously buggy, but with Game Freak, for whatever reason, it's never their fault, despite them being the ones who make the bloody Pokemon games. Oh, it's the system itself. Oh, it's the Pokemon Company. Oh, it's Nintendo. And look, I'm not coming at this from some Game Freak is lazy perspective. I'm not some graphics snob who needs all the settings cranked to maximum or high with ray tracing on. I'm coming at this from the perspective of someone who prefers their gaming experiences to at least be stable, to be consistent. Even if a game is just running 30 frames per second, it needs to be able to do that consistently. And Game Freak has consistently failed to do even that at times. Going back to the first generation, Pokemon Red and Green, do I really need to go into the specifics of Red and Green? Its reputation as a buggy mess precedes itself, to the point where the localized version, the more well-known Red and Blue, had to fix numerous bugs, visual blights, and general issues that would cause the game to crash. Not that it's saying much, the localized release of Red and Blue is a rather ramshackle, rough role-playing experience, and as famous as many of these glitches may be, and as fun as it may be to experiment with them for things like speedrunning, it really doesn't aid Game Freak's case that their debut was in such a shambling state. In hindsight, it's rather surprising that people were willing to overlook how unpolished the titles were and allow Pokemon to essentially conquer the globe. Ambitious or not, it doesn't make them any less of a struggle to play nowadays. Jumping forward to Generation 4 in Diamond and Pearl, certain moves would cause the game to slow down, and early copies of the game would have a pretty notorious habit of crashing. I recently did a FEBAS-only run on a physical copy of Pearl, and it quite literally crashed during the battle with Cynthia when I possibly could have won, as well as a few other times during said run. Did I mention this game came out around the same time as The World Ends With You? Jumping forward once more to Generation 6, the big leap to 3D in X and Y was rife with growing pains, none more notable than the often fluctuating frame rates and an infamous glitch where your game would freeze up in Lumio City and possibly cause you to lose all of your progress. And even though the games rarely made use of the 3D as a selling feature, the few times it did, it absolutely tanked the frame rate even further, as did the gimmicky new edition of Horde Battles. These issues were more or less present in Sun and Moon, minus the save glitch. Reports are that this time around were due to a number of players using PK Hex in ways that didn't cooperate with the game. And then there's the infamous Pokemon Tree and Pokemon dropped frames. Honestly, the performance of Sword and Shield's Wild Area would have been more forgivable if it didn't look like a PS3 game. An early PS3 game. Oh, and speaking of save game glitches, guess what Sword and Shield had? Yeah, this time it was due to a bug related to the autosave feature and microSD formatting, so most people had to shut it off and save manually until they patched out this problem. And issues like this are basically the only time the Game Freak will actually patch their problems. This is by no means a comprehensive breakdown of all the performance problems in Pokemon's proper entries. Hell, this isn't even unique to the Pokemon games that Game Freak has made. Prior to the cult phenomenon, they had performance problems in the platformer Pulseman. Now, Pulseman is a great game, but it does have its share of chug on the Genesis, although, at least in the case of that game, it does look impressive given the system hardware that they had to work with at the time. I didn't even get into how choppy their sort of main entry, sort of spin-off Switch game Legend Arceus turned out to be. Again, really enjoyed it, but the performance was not optimized for the system. And yeah, the Switch is old, but not only are there great, well-optimized original titles and terrific ports on the Switch, many of which came out years before any mainline Pokemon entry made its way onto the system, but Scarlet and Violet does not look like a game that should be so demanding for said hardware. And the same goes for Sword and Shield for that matter. Although at least in the case of those games, you could argue about the level of experience not being as extensive as, presumably, it would be for Scarlet and Violet. It's honestly insulting to the hard work that the developers of said titles went through to make their games run as well as they do on Nintendo's hybrid system, that people make such pathetic excuses for how badly Game Freak's games run on the Switch, or the 3DS, or the DS. Because this has been a consistent Game Freak issue. It's rare to find a game that they've made that doesn't have a Wailord-sized amount of performance issues. Like, I played Pokemon Black 2 in the lead up to Scarlet and Violet, and I can't remember any sort of struggles during my time with that game, but I could easily be forgetting an area or two. And even if that was the case, that's what? 2 generations out of 9 since Ruby and Sapphire were relatively problem-free. Oh wait, I forgot about the berry glitches. So yeah, just 1 generation. Now, granted, most of the issues I've mentioned thus far, with the exception of the first Pokemon games and the save glitches, they haven't been anywhere near as notable as the problems that Scarlet and Violet have launched with. And while it's possible they'll patch out some of these with a future update, I'd be hard-pressed to expect them to turn the entire game around and have it be buttery smooth with no notable hang-ups. It'll be playable, but it won't be on the same level of consistency as other Nintendo-published titles. I mean, why bother? The game's already a bestseller, and every other time they put out a poorly optimized title, people are quick to blame Nintendo, or the system, or the Pokemon Company itself instead of, you know, the developers who make the damn game, the ones who have a history of putting out games that don't run well and have a number of troublesome bugs, the one that has a sizable ownership in the Pokemon Company itself, so it's still technically them at fault if you do blame TPC for that. If Ubisoft or Sega had published this game, their respective developers, if not the publishers themselves, would have been raked over the coals for weeks, months, maybe even years down the line. I mean, even after being patched, Assassin's Creed Syndicate is still a punchline. But with Game Freak, they always get a collective pass. Just imagine if that Tactics Ogre remake came out in the same unfinished state. Square Enix's headquarters would be ashes, burned to the ground by the dozens of people who still care about Tactics Ogre, myself included. It's one of my favorite series. Side note, when are we going to get a remake or a port out the Night of Lodice? I know that one was published by Atlas, so there might be some rights issues, but what was I talking about again? Oh, right. At this stage, there is no room for shifting the blame elsewhere, and there is no excuse for Game Freak to have considered this to be launchable in the state that it is currently in, instead of pushing back their plans for the release of said game, even if it did mean they made slightly less money than they're already making from the multitude of other media that's already out there for Pokemon in this fiscal quarter. If Scarlet and Violet should be noted for anything at this moment, it should be for magnifying a problem that was always there, and hopefully will serve as a turning point for Game Freak's reputation. Because this is not acceptable, and it hasn't been for years. And I'm very, very tired of hearing the same old excuses. They knew that this game was not finished when they were going to launch it, and they didn't care. This is not a Switch problem. This is a Game Freak problem.